Hey friends, Graham here from the recordingrevolution.com, and we're going to do some more compression training this week. We looked at how to break down a compressor to its simplest parts earlier this week on the blog, and then today I want to show you a compressor in action. So pretty foundational, pretty basic if you've been mixing for a long time, but this is like the tool to unlocking really great sounding mixes. If you can get this, then you can just crush it in your mixes. So what I'm going to show you is how I'm compressing a lead vocal, because lead vocals are super dynamic, and there's a great way to display what a compressor can do. And I'm just going to show you some of the key elements of a compressor that we talked about in the blog earlier this week, show them to you in action here, and again, simplify them for you. Remember, there's only really 3 or 4 things that you need to focus on with a compressor, and you can ignore the rest. And I'm going to show those to you today, and so you'll kind of sort of see how this all comes together. So first, here is a song where, this is my vocal, by the way, so I kind of know the status of this. I actually tracked this. There was a little bit of compression on the way in, but if you look closely here, if I make this track bigger, this yellow one, you can see how dynamic it is, right? You can already see that over here. It's spiking on certain syllables. So we're gonna hear what that is. But let me zoom in here. I'm going to press play. You're going to hear this vocal in the mix, but it's got no compression. I have some EQ on it, has not been compressed, and so it's going to get a little lost in the mix. This is love. Okay, I chose this piece because it's widely dynamic. Some medium syllables here, but then you have like the t and the te for terrible, massive spike in volume, but free of freedom is this little teeny slice there. It jumps way down, and then the dumb part of freedom is kind of in the middle. And this sounds silly to break it down, but real singing isn't nice and consistent and in your face, especially in a recording, and you start to, I hear one syllable or some words, I don't hear other words, so you turn up the whole vocal track, but now these spikes are too loud. You turn down the track, but then now some words are too quiet, especially the end here, it's too quiet. Man, a compressor is going to fix a lot of these things. It's going to give you that nice, even, upfront vocal sound in this case. Let me show you a couple things we can do here. Let's solo this vocal. Let's get rid of all this delay. Here's just the raw vocal. This is love, terrible freedom. It's obviously easier to hear by itself, but no one's going to hear it by itself. They're going to hear it in the mix. So let's grab a compressor and get to work. Very simple. I'm going to grab the stock Dynamics 3 here, which is the compressor in Pro Tools. And very, very simple compressor, although you have way too many knobs on this thing, okay? So if you've read the other blog posts, and you're going to ignore the side chain for now, you're going to ignore the knee, okay? You're going to ignore anything, the key input, even this diagram. Just don't even worry about it. We're going to focus on 4 main things. We're going to focus on threshold, ratio, attack and release. I consider those one thing, and then gain. Okay, so I'm just going to show you what we want to do here. What we want to do in concept is very simple. I want this waveform to not sound like it looks. I want it to sound like it's nice and even and consistent. So what I need to do is use a compressor to turn down those peaks, those blasts of terrible, it's way too loud. I need to turn those down. I need the compressor to then turn up the free on freedom and just give me a nice, more even performance and then bring it all back up to an acceptable volume level. That's what I want the compressor to do in concept, and here's how we're going to do it with a simple stock compressor. First of all, we bring the threshold all the way up. It's the same thing as this orange knob here in this case. A threshold set at 0 means no compression is happening, okay? Here we go. This is love. If you look down here, you can see the input of the signal is way below the threshold. This is love. That never even comes close to that little arrow, so it's never going to get compressed. So there's literally no processing happening. You've got a compressor on it, but it's not actually doing anything. Okay, so what I want to go to is these loud peaks here. Terrible freedom. Do you see how much of a spike that was? That was like minus 0.5, whereas the This Is Love is here minus 13. That's a 10 dB or more swing of peak volume. It's just way too wide of a range. So I'm going to tweak the compressor to turn that kind of peak down. So what I'm going to do is dial the threshold down a little bit and see this meter here, which in my case is labeled GR, gain reduction. That's kind of the meter you want to watch to see what the compressor is doing. So I'm going to dial down the threshold just till it's actually affecting the audio. Terrible freedom. It's such a quick blast, it's hard to see, but you could see it pulled it down minus 3 dB. Terrible freedom. So what I want to do is to make this a little bit more apparent is I'm going to keep the ratio at 3:1. This could be 2:1, 3:1. The ratio really only matters as it relates to the threshold because you could have a really high ratio, 10:1, that you think is going to slam this thing. But if the threshold is really high, then it's not going to slam it. So let's just leave it at 3:1. That sounds fine. All I really care about is how much gain reduction is happening. What I want to do, though, is clamp down on that peak faster. So I'm going to speed up the attack a little faster. Let's try this. Terrible. Now what we see is a ton of compression. Now this means that I can either keep it where it is and let it knock off over 6 dB of gain reduction, or I can dial the threshold up a bit and see what happens. Terrible freedom. What we just did shows you the relation of how these knobs work. I turned the attack faster, so it seems to jump on the peak quicker, and it compressed more. But then I dialed up the threshold. I backed off on the threshold a bit, and it went from minus 6 dB of gain reduction to minus 3 dB. So I'm back to the gain reduction I had when the threshold was way down, but the attack was slower. You can see how now we can get to the same result, the same amount of compression with wildly different knobs. So the knobs and the settings don't really matter. What matters is that you kind of know what knobs you can pull and what it's doing to the audio. All we care about is, can I turn down that peak and then have it not turn down, let's say the rest of the word, freedom. Maybe I want freedom to be okay, or maybe I want it also to turn down the dumb part so that free isn't affected. Let's see what happens when it gets to freedom. Terrible freedom. So it doesn't compress the freedom. So let's pull the threshold down a little bit more. Terrible freedom. And what you see is the input signal here, terrible freedom, way high. The output signal here, terrible freedom, much more contained, right? What I can do is pull this down even more. Terrible freedom. Let's go right below the freedom. Terrible freedom. There. Now we see a massive gain reduction on terrible, on the tear part. No gain reduction on free, because the free is underneath the threshold still because it's so quiet. And a little bit of gain reduction on dumb. Watch it now. As you're going to see the gain reduction on tear, nothing happening on free, and a little bit of reduction on dumb. Terrible freedom. So now in essence, we've squashed a couple of the peaks and not affected the free part. So we have a much more contained signal. it's as if we turned down those peaks and now everything's a little bit quieter. This is where the makeup gain happens. This is where we can turn up the signal to compensate. So we can turn this up maybe 2 dB, so everything is a bit louder. But remember, in essence, what it's done is just turned up the quietest part. We've used compression to turn down the super loud part and turn this down a little bit, and then now we've turned this up a couple dB when this is not getting compressed at all, so it will match the bigger peaks. So we have a much more consistent performance. Let's take a listen.
Terrible freedom, terrible freedom.
What I want you to hear now is I'm going to bypass the compressor. This might have seemed a little technical, but it's very simple. It's hard. There's nothing for you to see, so you're going to have to just close your eyes and listen. I'm going to bypass the compressor, and you're going to hear the compressor change the sounds. We've gotten this super dynamic phrase, terrible freedom, big open vowels and closed vowels, from being way too dynamic to being nice and consistent. And you'll see how I lose some of the volume on free, and then there's too much volume on the other syllables when I get rid of the compression. So here it is compressed.
Terrible freedom.
Bypass.
Terrible freedom.
Now let's listen to it in context of the mix. Here's before.
Terrible
Engaged. Much better. And what we can do is give a little bit more gain as well. So we can give it 2 more dB of gain, put it at 4. Now let's do before. After. Do you hear how we can easily turn up the vocal to whatever level we need it to be to sit on top of the background vocals, on top of the horns, on top of whatever, and yet those big blasts of sound never take over the speakers, never jump out of place because it's contained. I call it contained gain. That's exactly what we've done. We've used a simple threshold to just only affect the things that cross it, the loud peaks. We've set a faster attack to clamp down on that vocal, so we have a much more compressed signal when it crosses that, but it won't affect the little quiet stuff. It only affects the loud stuff, so we can bring everything back up with the makeup gain. That's all we really want to do on the compressor. So we've got this phrase here. We'll go back in solo. Before, this is what it sounded like.
This is love. Terrible freedom. This is love. Oh.
Now let's give it the compressed, even version.
This is love. Terrible freedom. This is love. Oh, terrible freedom.
Everything feels like it's at the same volume. That's what a compressor does for you. It controls that dynamic range. It brings up those syllables or words that get swallowed because they're just quieter, and it puts everything on an even plane. That's how you get that up front vocal sound where you can feel and hear everything the singer is saying and doing. And this can apply to anything. Acoustic guitars that have way too much dynamic range, when they strum real hard, it pops out, but then some of the up strums are kind of tucked away. Use a compressor to contain it a little bit. Don't squash it too much, but you contain those peaks a bit, bring everything back up with a makeup gain, and put it back out there at an acceptable volume, and all of a sudden you have that consistently upfront acoustic guitar sound that doesn't jump all over the place. A little bit of compression like this across certain tracks in your mix, and all of a sudden you have this contained but still musical and upfront sound that you can control much better. And the whole point of this is to give the end listener or the end user a much easier listening environment where they can hear everything and they can go, I love that vocal, I love that guitar part, I love that song. No compression, and you have a widely dynamic song. It's very hard to hear things consistently throughout the mix. So it is a great tool. I call it contained gain. Just again, focus on the threshold and the ratio till you're seeing the gain reduction you want. And then attack and release, you'll play with to get a different tone. Faster attack's going to squash some of that peak, so you won't have as much transient, but you can get a fatter tone. Back it off, and you might get more of a punchy tone. So those are more of like the tonal things because they affect how the compressor compresses. But how much is the threshold and the ratio, and then your gain is just the final, like where do I want to place this track volume-wise now that it's contained and in place. That's going to be a typical compressor for most of you, even though they're going to look very different. I know you've got some compressors that are much simpler with just 2 or 3 knobs. I want you to get used to using this type of compressor because A, it's stock in your DAW. I've used just about every major DAW, and everyone's going to ship with something like this. And 2, it's more complicated than the simpler 1176 style compressors, or LA2As or whatever. So if you can get used to this and you understand what these knobs are doing, then you're going to have way more confidence when you mix, and you're going to know exactly what you want the compressor to do for you, and you'll find a way to get it to do it. Thanks for tuning in. Compressors in action. Again, this is Graham at therecordingrevolution.com. Leave me a comment. Let me know what your biggest frustration has been in compression, and maybe if this video has been eye-opening to you. I will see you on another video soon. Take care.